So, folks, Shahid Buttar has just arrived in the green room. We're going to go ahead and bring him in. Let me just go ahead and add him here. Shahid, how are you?
I'm doing all right, Ron, especially under the circumstances. How about you? How are you holding up?
I'm doing good, man. Good to see you. So, for anyone who is not familiar with Shahid, he is running in California's 12th district against the one and only, the queen of refrigerators, Nancy Pelosi. And he's also a digital rights activist. He has a very extensive resume in that field, and that's what we're going to be talking with him about today. And but first of all, let's check in a little bit just about how you're doing. How's everything going with the campaign? How's everything going on your end?
Better than, frankly, I would expect. Yeah, I had a chance to speak with the Commonwealth Club. It's an organization here in San Francisco that hosts large events. It was virtual on account of the pandemic and the shelter-in-place order, but that was a great opportunity. Just last week, we launched our own live stream inspired by people, including yourself, in the last few weeks.
Man.
Had a chance to talk with Linda Sarsour yesterday and Medea Benjamin last week. So that's been an opportunity just to stay connected with folks. The first month, actually, after the shelter-in-place order, the campaign really made a pivot, not unlike the way that Bernie and many other campaigns on the left, where we basically suspended voter outreach and just focused on mutual aid. And we were not really set up as a campaign to deliver services, but we are set up to deliver information. So we spent a few weeks just calling first, our few thousand volunteers here in the Bay Area, and then voters generally, just to make sure that everybody knew where they could find a free meal and which organizations were hosting pop-up food pantries that they could visit, how they could qualify for different benefits, what the process was to delay rent payments, for instance, that might be challenging. So that was our last few weeks, and we're just pivoting now back to voter outreach. And in fact, kind of as we speak, we're beta testing now and just launching distributed phone banking. And I do think this is a really exciting moment for our campaign, because this will be the first point at which anybody anywhere, like we have been for Bernie, can sign up to then jump into the process to call San Francisco voters on our behalf. And when I think about, Bernie's campaign, many of us were putting in those calls. We might have had weeks usually to flip entire states. We have over 6 months, and our race is just a single city. So it's imminently within reach, given the size of the movement that we're helping represent. And I'm excited to liberate this seat.
Well, I'm thrilled to hear that, man. And I'll have to check out some of the live stream. The only time your opponent has probably been around Medea Benjamin is if Medea Benjamin was being removed for protesting somewhere. That's likely the only time Nancy Pelosi would ever be cognizant of an activist like Medea Benjamin.
I'm sure that's absolutely true. Or it's an activist like Medea Benjamin perhaps was trolling Pelosi for her ice cream stash. But that's the other thing. You asked how things are going. And, it amazes me that so often Speaker Pelosi creates opportunities for us. She creates opportunities for us every time she supports Trump, every time she supports his trade policy or his foreign policy, every time that she said she wouldn't impeach him, and then every time she showed up and refused to impeach him for all of his crimes. I have said in the press that I feel like she's campaigning on my behalf, and going on television to show off her stash of $250 worth of ice cream in her $22,000 refrigerator, I think was... for me watching it, I was just like, you got to be kidding me, seriously? And I posted a shot of my freezer.
I saw that. Yeah. Well, wasn't it like the ice cream she posted too? Like, isn't it like someone posted like it goes for almost $12 a pint or something like that? It's very fancy ice cream.
$25 a pint when you factor in the delivery cost. So every one of those pints in her fridge was worth more or less everything in mine. And I think about what people are struggling with at the moment. There's so many people who don't know how to pay rent. There's so many people who are sick right now and can't get to a doctor because they can't pay for medicine. And they're looking at their elected leaders standing in front of industrial restaurant quality kitchen appliances filled to the brim with high-end gourmet foods that many of us can't afford. And if that's who's representing us, it's no surprise to me, frankly, that we're all getting fleeced by banks and that we have been for 30 years.
Exactly. You make the connections where it's like, oh, this is really the haves versus the have-nots. They're just flaunting it in our face. They just gave the banks trillions while telling the rest of us to pound sand. Then they went on vacation, and now they're showing off their refrigerators with their ridiculous. I didn't even know ice cream that expensive was even made. And here's the deal. I've actually had some exposure. I was at this party, and it was a vegan themed party. And, the person who was hosting the party has means, they're a successful musician who has done very well for themselves. And so it was sponsored by a couple organizations. one of the organizations was a vegan ice cream company. I forget the name off the top of my head. It was some of the best ice cream I've ever had, though. And it's an avocado-based vegan ice cream.
Okay.
Dude, it went for like, I think it was maybe 10. Like, it wasn't even close to that. It was expensive ice cream. And I ate it, and I was like, okay, if I buy this ever, it's a special treat. This is very expensive vegan ice cream because it's amazing. It's some of the best ice cream I've ever tasted. And I'm like, this is going to be a special treat if I ever get it, but even that was like significantly less than $25 a pint.
Yeah.
I don't know.
An ice cream to make it worth $25 a pint, I mean, that's a question in itself. And at the end of the day, I mean, I'm not trying to, beat up on an ice cream company or people who like ice cream. It's not about that. It's just the fact that I think you nailed it. It's the legitimate outrage towards people who they are public servants who are ultimately oligarchs, right? I mean, these are people who are not subject to the same pressures and challenges that the rest of us are. I'm a renter in the country's most brutal rental market. She's a landlord who makes $1 million a year off rent payments alone, let alone capital gains in her congressional salary and all the other money that she and her husband make. I mean, we describe in foreign contexts leaders as oligarchs when they combine political power and economic might, and we are hesitant to use the term here, but the shoe absolutely fits. And I am running against an oligarch of our supposed republic, and I'm doing that as an exercise in attempting to vindicate and reclaim our democracy. And I see, another thing I'll just say here, when you asked how the campaign's going, I feel incredibly grateful for the thousands now of people who have flocked to our campaign in the last week alone since Bernie Sanders suspended his. And I'm very humbled by the opportunity to represent a movement at the same time that I'm seeking the opportunity to represent a city formally in Congress. And, we now have well over 15,000 donors that are supporting our campaign, which is absurd to me. And so far beyond anything I could contemplate at the outset when we launched this campaign in 2018. And given all the support that we're getting from every corner of the country and every part of the city, I have a great deal of confidence that presuming the election happens and that we can keep the post office open and the infrastructure is reliable and secure, I have a great deal of confidence that we'll win this election in November.
I hope so, man. I'm pulling for you. But there might be something, though, with oligarchs who really like ice cream. Because who else loves ice cream? Joe Biden.
Okay.
So I actually think, regular folks like an ice cream. That's great. But oligarchs like an ice cream. There's got to be, there is no good oligarch, though. So I guess it's like, some of them like ice cream, some of them don't. Doesn't really make a difference.
Someone should do a study on who likes what flavors. I wonder if oligarchs have a particular flavor that they prefer. That might be an interesting.
Probably Tears of the Poor. That's probably a mutually favorite flavor, if I had to take a guess. So let's talk digital rights, man. You are very good on this issue. And, I know I personally, you brought up Bernie suspending his campaign, which, of course, has been pretty tough for all of us. But, I think a lot of people, myself being one of them, when that happened, we're like, okay, where am I going to go now? Where am I going to go to now? Because I got to go somewhere. And, for some people, I know for me, it's like, okay, I'm really going to focus on causes. I'm going to focus on net neutrality. I'm going to focus on municipal broadband. I'm going to focus on cause-based initiatives. I'm going to focus on, advocacy groups that are doing worthwhile work, like Fight for the Future and organizations like that. And then other people were like, well, I'm going to go to another grassroots campaign, and they find their way to you, or they find their way to, Amanda Sibby or Lauren Ashcraft or Rebecca Parsons, or, the list goes on and on. I'm not trying to leave anybody off, but, there's a lot of lists of progressives trying to make something happen. But so as far as digital rights is concerned, what are some of the things we should be particularly concerned about right now?
One of the ones at the moment that's in sharp focus in Congress, though you wouldn't know it since the body is not convening, is the recent expiration of several provisions of the Patriot Act, which have finally expired, as they have been scheduled to do so on no fewer than half a dozen prior occasions. And on every one of those occasions, most recently December of last year, Nancy Pelosi teamed with authoritarian Republicans to extend those measures. And, I'm not going to thank the pandemic for anything, but one of the things it did is basically force off the congressional table, off the agenda, the space to consider extending these laws any further. And just to be clear, these are not security measures. These are surveillance measures that are ultimately security theater measures. They have been found by independent reviewers in the government to have never prevented any attacks. What they do, however, is compromise both the privacy and the security, and more importantly, frankly, the dissent of people subject to those provisions. And because those provisions have been used in secret without notice to the targets, it's basically created this specter of ambient monitoring. And that's especially pernicious to dissent. And my concern is not privacy in the surveillance arena. My concern is democracy. It's, yes, surveillance offends privacy, but because it inhibits speech, it's democracy that it ultimately threatens. And that's what concerns me. I'm an immigrant to this country. I don't take our democracy for granted. I care about it very deeply. And I have since my earliest memories, the tired, huddled, poor masses yearning to breathe free. That is me. That is my family. I understand that. And one of the reasons I'm running for office is because I see the promise and the vision in that commitment compromised. It's not threatened at this point. We have lost it. We have abandoned any pretense to the vision that brought my family halfway around the world to be here. The promise of liberty and opportunity, of justice and fairness, of legitimacy in government. And whether it's, the plutocracy that has infected, money and politics, for instance, or whether it's in the digital rights arena, this hammer fist, or the potential, maybe I should make that point clear too. A lot of people might not connect mass surveillance to authoritarianism because mass surveillance has been in place now for 15 years. And some people would say we don't live in an authoritarian society. First of all, I would just say that to Eric Garner first. And that's an interesting lens through which to reflect, because to some people, fascism is a future fear. And for many Americans, particularly those with dark skin, fascism has been here for many years. It's not a recent phenomenon to people who have been subject to arbitrary state violence, xenophobia, and militarism. These are among the issues that Dr. King raised, for instance, in his era. In the digital rights arena, you're setting aside surveillance, other things that are happening and this isn't so digital rights, but I want to connect it because it's the next phase beyond surveillance is detention. So the pandemic is forcing a lot of discussion about public health motivated surveillance measures. And I understand the need for some of those subject to very tight limits. And I'd love to get into that in just a second. But there's another specter, another landscape of contended powers. And this is really disturbing to me because it indicates not just a failure of our civic institutions, but the press as well. And, I'm grateful for you offering a space for this. The only outlets to this point that have covered the Trump administration's attempt to suspend habeas corpus are Newsweek and Politico. And they've each written one story in the last month and nothing since. And there is a completely, as far as I can tell, secret process happening in Washington where the Trump administration is seeking the power to allow chief justices to disregard core constitutional protections to prevent people from being detained arbitrarily. And it's one thing to say that we need to have maybe surveillance measures or maybe even conceivably, more coercive measures responding to a pandemic. But the point there is if we're going to do anything like that, we have to have trust in the process. There has to be transparency. There has to be accountability. There's been none of that at any point in the last 100 years that we have been practicing domestic surveillance in the United States. It has always been politicized. It has always been abused. And there's no reason for us to trust, especially in the face of a pandemic, the extension or the expansion of these very dangerous powers, particularly considering who's in the White House.
Yeah, and I think you bring up an important point here, because a lot of times when you bring up these issues, sometimes people's knee-jerk reaction is to be like, wait, we're in a pandemic and you're not taking the pandemic seriously. It's like, whoa, back up. I take the pandemic very seriously. But there's a possibility for two truths to be a truth. One truth: this is a very serious pandemic that we need to take extremely seriously. We need to quarantine. We need to take all these measures completely seriously and need to do as much as we can to level this thing off. But a second truth: there are some unnecessary overreaches by the government, and they're weaponizing a bad situation for their advantage. Those can both be true at the same time. And we're seeing it play out. And yeah, you're saying there is a time and a place where perhaps some surveillance can be helpful. Like if there was for instance, where say somebody gets it and, maybe they weren't really quarantining, maybe they weren't really doing what they were supposed to. And they're just like, oh, geez, I don't even know where I was the past few weeks. I might've been around a susceptible person. I'm not sure. So then them in cooperation with other entities can say, okay, well, we can take a look at your phone records. We can kind of ping where you were and when, and then you can reach out to anyone who might've been compromised. That's one thing. That's productive and transparent and fair. and doesn't infringe on anyone's civil liberties because you're working in conjunction with these other entities. That is light years different than just saying like, well, we're going to let Google find out where you're going all the time.
You nailed
Those
it.
are two completely different things.
And to press on that, this program by Apple and Google, I can understand, to your point, some people might welcome this and say this is a thoughtful response to a public health crisis. And it can be, it might be. I'm not going to throw it under the bus at the outset. But the point here is that if we're flirting with these kinds of powers, we have to have meaningful oversight. And it's precisely what has been entirely absent in the entire arena surrounding digital rights. I mean, remember in the last year that several times that Mark Zuckerberg has gone to Capitol Hill to testify before Congress, and just the absolutely inane, imbecilic questions he's been asked by ignorant members of Congress who don't even understand the first thing about the landscape that they're being charged with governing. And in this arena, if we're going to allow not just government, but also private sector surveillance measures, and a contact tracing app, and what makes the Apple and Google innovation so interesting, is that it's cross-platform, and I've long been a favor of cross-platform initiatives to put users before corporate interests, and so that's an interesting thing in the first place too. They're running it at the OS level, not at the application layer, so it doesn't require opt-in, which means that it is less respective of user privacy than an alternative set of, the hypothetical that you sketched out. And I'm not going to say that that's necessarily problematic, but especially if we're disregarding opt-in rights, we need to have robust oversight. Where is this data going? Who collects it? Who retains it? What can they use it for? Who else do they share it with? These are not parameters that should be left defined. It's absolutely critical that in any private or public sector surveillance measure, whether motivated by perceived security needs or public health, that there be parameters defined in advance for how they can be used, who can collect them, under what conditions, how long they can retain them, and who they give them to. Those parameters on collection, dissemination, retention, and use, those are critical ingredients to ensure legitimacy. And they've been entirely absent in all the other contexts that we've adopted surveillance. And so the idea that a pandemic should allow us to be more comfortable with these very same potentially authoritarian measures that have prompted my and many other people's concerns in the past, it's premature unless we actually show up in the way that we've been saying for the last 20 years. I'm not saying that we should conduct no government surveillance. I'm saying that if we conduct any surveillance, it should be subject to meaningful oversight with independent judicial review, with a real warrant requirement, and somebody standing on the other side of it saying, oh, this is just a government witch hunt. Oh, this is a corrupt investigator spying on his ex-wife. Oh, and that happens, incidentally. We know dozens of cases where that's been found to have happened.
Oh yeah, that's what a lot of the police officers were caught using facial recognition for. They were trying to find like information on exes and stuff. It's just, well, so what is a better approach then? As far as like a concrete policy, if you were in office right now, what would be your approach to this?
So with the contact tracing app, I would want to be doing oversight of any companies developing one. And the critical questions I'd be asking that I'd want to see in at least their corporate policies, if not a public policy to restrain what companies could do here. First, a use limit. Any data collected from the mobile devices or the health records of anyone being used in a contact tracing setting should be limited only to contact tracing and sharing information only about potential virus exposure, not, for instance, leaked to credit agencies, not leaked to law enforcement, certainly not leaked to military and intelligence agencies. At the moment, anything that comes in through any of those channels is widely shared across all of them. And so tight limits to prevent that from happening. Data retention controls here would be critical. From what I understand, people are contagious when they have been exposed to the virus, not indefinitely. And so ensuring that people don't appear in the database for years and years at a time would be that's a retention limit. The dissemination limit we talked about, that's the limiting. It's the information slipping into other hands. And I mentioned credit agencies. I want to just press on that. We already know that surveillance data is used to discriminate, not just by the government, but putting credit agencies in a position to discriminate against people according to information that they didn't ask anyone to collect. And that's again, this sort of example of a dissemination violation with a use creep. And so the use creep in my mind is the biggest issue. And that's exactly why we've been concerned about corporate surveillance. Many companies collect information. Their purpose is to sell you things, but it leaks to the government and their purpose is to watch what you say. And so the dissemination can expand use because in different entities' hands, information can be used in different ways. And so that's why dissemination and use limits are so critical. The biggest thing here, you asked what I'd want to see in a policy. The biggest part for me that's missing is process, and that is oversight, right? At the moment, we have basically a clown in the White House and no one minding the store. And, you know, whatever random thing pops into his head becomes national policy for a day. And he claims that he has absolute authority, contrary to every iota of our national, you know, tradition and text. I mean, it was really alarming to me to see a president claim entirely falsely, not just authoritarian, but limitless powers. And it's an interesting moment and I would invite any of your listeners. There's one line, and this is a sitting U.S. president who told us in 1961 to take nothing for granted. And the future of our democracy is very much at stake. And I don't want to say again in the abstract future, there is a current, clear and present danger to our Constitution sitting in the White House. And his congressional enablers, the chief among whom I'm challenging in the November election, have done nothing to stop him. And I see in these not just the potential responses to the pandemic, but also the failures to respond to the pandemic, right? Think about the weeks it took for shelter-in-place orders to emerge in many parts of the country. Think about the weeks it took to order personal protective equipment, and then the shady ways that this administration was interfering in international supply chains, pissing off our allies by basically stealing their equipment because, you know, we were too short-sighted here to do the right thing and guard public health when we had the chance and advance warning. It is an object, I want to make this clear, it is shameful and unacceptable that the United States is at the top of the global pandemic rankings. We had months to prepare, and more Americans have died already. You know, many multiples more have died than died in the 9/11 attacks. And we need to internalize this as a moment of profound failure by our political apparatus. Both parties are responsible for this, and leaders in both parties. And there's absolutely no reason that we should concede to defer to the people who delivered us into the gaping maw of this crisis, the opportunity to continue undermining the rights and needs of the American people.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, and it goes beyond. I mean, yeah, like you said, like both parties are complicit in this. Both parties are responsible for this. And it goes even past that. And it goes to, well, this is what our system produces too. When you look at our system, we're just not equipped. When you break it down to like the biggest, just nuts and bolts, like explain it in 30 seconds or less, it's basically like, look, we're set up for profit above all else, for the bottom line above all else. We have a handful of companies that control everything. Wall Street oversees everything. They're just pulling the strings. And when you have an entire social system and economy set up that way, you are not going to be equipped to handle anything resembling a pandemic. And your leadership doesn't care because they're still going to be fine.
Yeah, all of their success metrics indicate that things are going great. I mean, with the exception of the stock market, but the point is Nancy Pelosi's fridge is full, right? And so that indicates that the failure is not internalized in the way that we would need it to be in order for our institutions to be responsive. And that is a failure, not just at the policy layer. It's a failure structurally in the capacity of our system politically, in the capacity of our system economically, in the capacity for any particular industrial sector like health insurance to respond to emerging needs. And this is a gaping illustration of the failures of the paradigm that preceded us. Why the US and South Korea got warnings on the same day. Our first confirmed cases were on the same day. Why in South Korea is the curve so flat, whereas here it looks like a math function, with an infinite asymptote. The difference particularly is that in South Korea, you can get tested and treatment if you're sick, period. It's a no-brainer. We don't even have that still here yet. We have a theoretical commitment to free testing if you can source a kit, and we have a theoretical commitment to free treatment for COVID, but nothing else. But then what do we do the next time there's a pandemic or when the virus mutates? Do we have to pass a new bill to allow people to get free testing for every version of the virus that emerges? I mean, that is absolutely senseless. And just stupid. Why would we do that when we can get in front of the next pandemic, when we frankly could have been in front of this one by simply saying that we have the money, we have the resources, we have the richest civilization in the history of humankind. If someone in America needs to see a doctor, they see the doctor. I read today, I can't remember the publication, it was The Guardian, quoted a a doctor who spoke of a patient that they were intubating, whose last words, potentially of their life, were, "Who is going to pay for this?" And the doctor was describing their own heartbreak at their patient at the end of their life, potentially worried more about the cost than their care. What is that about, people? We are better than this.
Well, it's insane. And when you see every single article from like the corporate media, they're always saying how much this, how much the CARES Act is going to cost the federal government. They always be like, and it's going to cost this much and it's going to cost that much. First of all, it's not really costing them anything, because they're actually just giving us an advanced loan on our future taxes. That's all they're doing. So it's not really costing them a dime. Second of all, no one asked how much it's going to cost when trillions were given to the banks. So this is just, I mean, this is an oligarchy. Like, this is a straight up plutocracy. And it's unbelievable. When you see stuff like that, you just look at that and you're just like, this is a capitalism death cult. This isn't a country. Like what the hell are you talking about? How much is it going to cost? People are dying. People can't get food. People can't make rent. And you're worried about the bottom line, that it's going to cost the government, who's screwing you over every opportunity they get. And why do we see headlines like that? Is it because every journalist in the country is completely brainwashed? Not necessarily. It's because that's the way our media functions, because guess what? They're owned by the same entities that own the politicians, that own the judges, that own the corporations. It's a handful of owners that own everything. The game is rigged, and we need a freaking new game.
The only place I'd push back, I'm with you on all of it. I wouldn't say that there's a handful of owners. I think the owners are more of a class, and it is the 0.1%. Sure. But there's more than a handful of people in that 0.1%. So I locate it less in a tight conspiracy, but I absolutely agree with you that effectively that there has been a class war that we long ago lost, we the American people, to capital. And people oftentimes describe capitalism as if it were consistent with democracy. But no two systems could be more diametrically opposed. Capitalism is predicated on economic inequality, and democracy requires political equality. They run in opposite directions. There's profound tension between the two, and capitalism ate our democracy a long time ago, particularly under the Clinton administration. When you describe capitalism as a death cult, I want to just expand on that. I would describe it as a racist death cult, and I will cite Dr. Martin Luther King for that proposition. He told us this decades ago. And at the time when he described the intersecting evils of militarism, capitalism, and racism, which can be, you can see that illustrated in any number of ways. In his era, take 1953, right, when the US imposes a right-wing dictatorship on Iran after Iran tried to nationalize its oil fields. What was that? Militarism, racism, and capitalism. Capitalism for the oil, racism towards, a country whose democratic rights we were running roughshod over, and militarism is how we effectuated that resource grab. That's been the play we've been running for 70 years. And what did we get for it? A climate catastrophe, right? Even before the pandemic hit, it was clear that capitalism was a death cult, because it is marching our species off a cliff. And it is frankly preying on the future by taking resources that don't belong to us, taking resources that do belong to the future, civilizational and objects of inheritance, and plundering them. That's what every drop of oil that we pull out of the ground is. That's what fracking is. It is preying on the future by taking its resources so the people in the present can live more comfortably. And that was bankrupt before. It was bankrupt in King's Day. And at the time, he told us that it was justice everywhere that was threatened. And in the years since, it's come to be life on this planet that is threatened. And the pandemic dials it up even further, where no, it's not about future generations anymore. And I want to be rigorous here. I'm not going to claim that the climate crisis drove the pandemic, but I will claim that corporate resource extraction did. And here's the case for that. We know that habitat encroachment increases contacts between human beings and wild animals. There is a strong theory that the coronavirus was a zoonotic disorder that came from bats through pangolins. Habitat encroachment, corporate resource extraction, drives both climate chaos and potentially pandemics. And the idea that in both of these contexts, we have put corporate profits before the lives, not just of individuals, not just of entire communities, but at this point, tens of thousands of Americans alone. And that number is not coming down, y'all. It is appalling to me. It amazes me that we accept this. I mean, we sing anthems about being in a land of the free and the home of the brave. You might think that we're free if you think about freedom as like the freedom to spend all your money and die homeless because you can't get the care that you need. But you can't claim that we're brave when we're being taken to the cleaners the way that we have been and have been. This is not, and none of this is recent. I've been fighting these fights for 20 years. Bernie Sanders has been doing it for 50, and I watch Americans getting fleeced while talking about being brave and free this whole time. And it's like, what planet are we on, people? And I just want to, again, bring that back to my race. I think, you mentioned before the dynamic in media, and I want to just, raise up an argument that Bernie Sanders has made, that corporate media cost us a president who was actually poised to address some of these issues. Another way of putting that is not only is capitalism and democracy unfortunately in tension, but our news media is undermining our democracy.
Oh, big time. They are. I mean, hey, Noam Chomsky said it best. He's like, any authoritarian regime would be envious of the American media. That's a paraphrase of what he actually, but that's essentially the message of what he was saying. And yeah, I mean, the idea that our media structure is inherent to democracy, it is the total opposite of that. In many other countries, our media structure would be illegal. In Norway, our media structure would not be legal. And, I hope someday we see a world where it's not legal here. And stuff like CNN and MSNBC and Fox News can't even exist anymore. And by the way, I am fine referring to it as a racist death cult instead of just a death cult, because that makes it even worse, which I'm all for, because it should sound as bad as possible, because that's what it is. And then you'll see some blue no matter who people who are going, well, I got to pick between the capitalist death cult and the racist capitalist death cult. And I'm going to go for the capitalist death cult because that at least they're not tweeting mean things.
Well, the scary thing is that Biden, unfortunately, has the same history of racial predation that Trump has.
I know, right?
Done more to put millions of dark-skinned Americans in prison than Donald Trump has. And that's a very unsettling realization. But many of us who long supported the person better suited to be our next president, Bernie Sanders, we've been making this point. And Biden is nobody's hope for anything. And I don't frankly think there's a snowball's chance in hell he can win this race. He doesn't have support. He needs a teleprompter to finish a sentence. He doesn't have a vision. And he frankly has been preying on so many different sectors of Americans who he's going to need. He's preyed on women. He's preyed on minorities. He put Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court. And my favorite is when people talk about, oh yeah, think about the Supreme Court.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Think about the Supreme Court. We got to go for the guy who voted for Scalia.
Right.
We got to go for that guy and the Clarence Thomas thing. And yeah, he has a great history there.
And while we're on the Supreme Court, I'll just throw this out there. I don't get a chance to talk about it a lot, but I have a proposal to end judicial life tenure to recover judicial independence. And the key there is basically making sure that Supreme Court justices don't sit in judgment over the rest of us for their entire lives. There's no good reason for it. That can be overturned through a simple act of Congress, does not take a constitutional amendment. It would have profound consequences for the nomination process. It would depoliticize the court. And it might be one way that we can recover meaningful access to justice, despite, I see Brett Kavanaugh on the court now. I fought the Kavanaugh nomination in 2006 to the DC circuit the first time I worked in Washington. And, I watched the right wing take our courts over. And unfortunately, Joe Biden was part of that as a Democrat. And that's not acceptable. We have to have accountability for those kinds of failures and acts that fueled the right wing, not merely failed to mount resistance. He was actively part of the right wing takeover of the courts. And to me, that is entirely unacceptable.
Amen, man. So where can people go to find out more about you? We're out of time, but where can people go to learn more about Shahid Buttar?
Thanks, Ron. Check us out online. We're at shahidforchange.us. We're also on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Shahid for Change, and YouTube, I should say.
And it's just for spelled out, right? F-O-R?
Yep. Shahid's SHAHIDFORCHANGE. Always great to be with you. Just one last thing I'll say. You, as doing real journalism, is one reason I'm so appreciative. Our post about me appearing with you today, I think it's a telling reflection of our moment that it takes comedians to do real journalism. So thanks for the work.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that, man. And yeah, thanks so much for illuminating us on all these issues. I love talking to you. I can talk to you all day about these things. And I know it's a common interest that we both share. So I hope to have you back on again soon. And in the meantime, best of luck with everything, man. I'm rooting for you.
Thanks, brother. Peace.
Cheers, buddy. Peace. Shahid Buttar, man, that guy, he's so good on those issues. He's so well spoken on it too. Like, he used to work with the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, so he has a very extensive background in those issues, and he speaks upon them just so succinctly and so well.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you want to know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your news